Okay, we will now hear from the committee as a whole. At this time, we will go into committee of the whole, and this will allow all members to vote for both academic and finance committee agenda items. And information item number 1 in your booklet, the bond and loan feasibility update, begins on page 1-1 of your agenda book. And Mr. Nick Fuller will provide background for this information. Thank you.
Good morning. This is just an informational item to you all. This is a report that contains updates on all of the bond or loan feasibilities that you reviewed over the past year from October of 23 until this month. Includes the actual dates of those bond issues along with the negotiated terms for the interest rates and the years of the loans. This is just an informational item for you. If there are any questions.
This is pretty routine, isn't it?
Yes, sir. Every year in October, we present this to you.
Any questions? Okay, thank you, Nick. Action item number 2, the report on intercollegiate athletic revenues and expenditures for 2023 and 24, and it begins on page 2-1 of the agenda book, and Mr. Fuller will also address that.
Thank you. And if you all recall, at the July meeting, we reviewed the budget for the athletic expenditures for the current year of 25. This is the report of the actual expenses for last year that ended July 30th. For 23-24 fiscal year, 4-year institutions had $254.9 million of athletic expenditures, and the 2-year colleges had $5.4 million. This is an increase of 5.6% over 22-23, and the prior year from 21-22 to 22-23 was around a 17% increase. So those expenditures have flattened out on the increases each year. The next chart on the slide shows the revenues for all of the campuses by the different sources. We have 2 different columns, one including University of Arkansas at Fayetteville and one without. They have so much larger numbers than everyone else, it kind of skews the percentages. The next very colorful chart is a breakdown by type of source for each of those institutions, how much of each source contributes to their total revenue. And this should be in your book as well, hard to see. The next slide is a total of the expenditures offset by those revenues by a source, again broken out with Fayetteville in one of the categories and one without them. And then the same chart as previously, but broken out by expenditures. Any questions on the athletic expenses? There were not any that really stood out as outliers from what they had done in the past. The biggest change we've seen is there was an increased cost for travel, but in general, travel costs have gone up for everyone.
Colors, you have a good illustration.
Yes, sir.
Any questions from the board? If not, do I hear a motion to recommend to the full board approval of the report on intercollegiate athletic revenue and expenditure?
Second.
Have a motion made and second. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor would indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
By like sign if
Aye.
you oppose. Okay, thank you. Action item number 3, recommendation for state funding of capital projects 25 through 27 biennium, beginning on page 3-1 of your agenda book. And Mr. Fuller will also address that.
Thank you. We'll start by This is capital recommendations for facilities and maintenance needs across the campuses that have been submitted to us from each campus, and then recommendations made to you. Currently, there's over $5.3 billion in replacement value of the facilities on campuses. They are aging. Well over 50% of the useful life of those facilities have been expensed, probably pushing closer to 55, 60% now. There is $1.18 billion that was requested by institutions for various specific projects across the state. And there's $3.6 billion in deferred maintenance needs across the campuses, with 474 million of that categorized as critical maintenance needing to be addressed within the next year. I will tell you before we move on to the recommendations, these projects, while we make recommendation for them every biennium, at most we've probably seen $5 to $10 million released to individual campuses in every 2 years. There is not any dedicated source to be able to fund these projects, just and happenstance if one's able to get funding releases from the legislature or the governor. So we do make the recommendation, but majority of the time there is no funding going to these projects.
I assume some of these schools get private money for these?
Yes, sir. Yeah, this is the request for state funding for these projects. Yes, sir. And there should be a very long chart in the manual that shows each of the schools, their individual requests, along with the recommendations we made for each one, and then the deferred maintenance and critical maintenance recommendations. But there's a total of $389.2 million recommended for the new projects. So 389 million out of the 1.1 billion requested. 240.6 million of that is for the new construction technology, 47 million for critical maintenance, 72 million for deferred maintenance, and then 28.9 million for equipment and library needs on campuses. Say the recommendations for critical maintenance is done at 10% of the actual need for each campus is how we make that recommendation. And for deferred maintenance is 1% of their requested need. Are there any questions on these capital recommendations? Now, I will mention to you as well, these will be presented, post your recommendation, they'll be presented to the legislature for approval on November 6th at the institutional budget hearings, once your recommendation is made.
I have one question. When you make the selection for the approval funds, do you do that by committee or do you do that by your office?
For the actual release of the funds?
Yeah.
Depending on who's giving the funding, we don't make those selections at all. It might be the legislature that approves which project gets a release of funds. The governor's office the institution may have made a request to the governor's office for one-time funds, and they select which one they want to release funds to from their one-time sources of funding they have throughout the state. But we don't have any input on which one actually gets
So
approved
it's
for funding.
done outside your office then?
Yes, sir.
the Selection process.
Yeah, we might help facilitate the release of the money, but we don't make the decision on who gets the actual funding.
Okay. Any additional questions, everybody? Do I hear a motion to recommend to the full board approval of the economic or the state funding of capital projects for
So moved.
25 through 27?
So moved.
Okay. Have a motion made and seconded. Do we have a discussion on that? Anybody? All those that would in favor of that, say aye.
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 Any opposed by like sign? Okay. Okay, we move to action item number 4. The economic feasibility of Arkansas State University, Jonesboro begins on page 5-1 of the agenda book. And Mr. Fuller?
Thank you. This is going to be for a bond issue for up to 30 years at an amount of $30 million with a rate of approximately 5.5%. To be used for educational and general purposes with funding coming from tuition and fee revenues. The proceeds from the bond issue will be used for the design, construction, and equipping of a College of Veterinary Medicine building. You know, we've reviewed the program for that. This is the bond issue to be able to build the veterinary building. In addition to the money for the construction, $138,480 annually will be transferred to a maintenance fund for upkeep on that building as per coordinating board policy. So you see the last item with all of the maintenance needs, a lot of those are for buildings that were built prior to this maintenance policy being adopted by you all in 2010. So representatives from the institution are here. If you have any questions on this bond issue, we are open for any questions.
When is this program scheduled to start? When will this building be finished? Got to be in a hurry.
Yes, sir.
A much needed program, for sure.
You bet it is.
Any additional questions from the board?
I move we accept.
Okay, do I have a motion made to accept? Do I have a second? Motion made to seconded. All those that would in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
All
Aye.
opposed by like sign. Okay. Okay, at this time then, that completes the Finance Committee review of agenda items 2 through 4 to be recommended to the full board. Agenda item number 1 was reviewed as an information item. We can now adjourn from considering agenda items 1 through 4 by the committee. And do I have a motion that we adjourn from the Finance Committee? Second? Motion made and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye.